Partial funding for this program has been provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. At least 170 German citizens were brought to trial and convicted in 1944 as participants in the last plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. It was not an isolated act, but only the last of over 20 attempts and plots to overthrow the Nazi leadership. Acts of individual conscience at war with an overpowering national consensus.
Was ich an politischen Erfahrungen persönlich gemacht habe, hat für mich mancherlei Schwierigkeiten in der Folge gehabt, weil ich ja sehr lange für das Deutschtum in Polen gearbeitet habe und aus dieser Zeit heraus ein vielfaches Hin und Her in der Einstellung gegenüber den Polen praktisch erlebt habe. Das ist eine...
Aber nicht ein vielfaches Hin und Her, das Sie dem Nationalsozialismus zur Last legen.
Die wesentlichen Gedanken an die vielen Morde.
Morde?
Die im Inland und im Ausland passiert sind.
Sie sind ja ein schäbiger Lump! Brechen Sie unter der Gemeinheit! Ja oder nein? Verbrechen Sie darunter?
Herr Präsident,
ja oder nein auf eine klare Antwort?
Nein.
We lived in Berlin when the Nazis came to power. And there were lots of people in Germany, they were still inclined to like National Socialism in the beginning, because they were first national, and they were secondly thinking social. That means industrial workers will be treated well, and they must have their share in the governing of the country, and this is going to be social, and it's going to be national, and that's going to be just what we need.
The Germans came from more than 1,000 years of monarchist traditions, and they had not adjusted to democratic self-government. And there came Hitler, that leader from nowhere, and put on the old feelings a new head, and walked and worked the nation as if it was a monarchy, but no traditional strings attached in the moral, traditional, ethical way. But that didn't appear at once.
There were a few people in Germany who recognized the emerging danger and responded to it. Who were they? What made them choose to act against the new regime with so very few prospects for success? They knew they were endangering themselves, as well as their friends and families. Coming from such diverse backgrounds, how did they find each other? Why weren't they able to create an organized resistance movement? But above all, what could they do? In the Nazi police state, what could anyone do? This question was faced in different ways by people who often didn't know each other, but were eventually drawn together. People as diverse as Julius Leber, a trade union leader and a former Reichstag deputy.
He was an editor of the local paper and member of the Reichstag. He came to Lübeck, I think, in 22, 23. I was about 10 years old then. And I met him often until he went to prison and I went to Norway in the spring of 1933. I mean, he was an intellectual, but very close to ordinary people in the city. Very impressive, militant kind of a political leader. I remember sometimes there were not just oral quarrels with the Nazis, the growing Nazi movement, but even clashes at meetings, gatherings, whatnot. And he would never be in the background. He would be in front of those who did take a fight, even in the streets. And he was in the concentration camp of Papenburg, near the Dutch border, and then several years in Sachsenhausen. And it's just unbelievable the kind of torture he went through.
Helmut James Count von Moltke, an international lawyer and a descendant of one of Germany's great 19th century military heroes.
On the 30th of January, a friend said, well, it's a good thing the Nazis have come to power because it's going to be like any other government. It has its time and then it gets tired and then it's replaced by another government. And Helmut got furious, or not furious, terribly excited and said, how can you say such a thing when this is a terrible catastrophe that has happened? How can you say such a thing? It's the beginning of the end. He said that the very day it happened. He became a lawyer in Berlin, and he helped as much as he could to get people out with as much as possible. And he said to all of those who knew, get out, get out, get out, because he's going to do what he says in his book. He was not a nationalist, of course, he was anti-nationalist, but he was hardly national. His values had never to do with nationalism. His values were completely different, wider. Within himself, he was a very free man. That's why he could resist and be critical. So I think it was a terrific loss for Germany to have killed him. I really do think that.
Adam von Trott zu Zolz, a civil servant with an American great-grandmother. As a Rhodes Scholar, Adam von Trott had close personal ties to England.
We were at Oxford together when it happened, you see, when Hitler came to power. And of all of the Germans there, Adam's reaction was, in many ways, to me, the most interesting, because he knew what it meant, all right. And he didn't either think it would easily go away, nor did he have any intention to leave it alone. Some people then started thinking of emigrating, and I would have had every sympathy, myself with that feeling, because it was so alarming what Hitler did when he came to power, the way he clamped down on the place. But Adam he didn't ever view it in those terms as something that was beyond his reach. He felt, well, I belong to this society. I'm not prepared to give it up to Hitler. I'm not prepared to accept that he's got it.
Dr. Karl Gerdler, a conservative politician and mayor of the city of Leipzig.
Wenn wir mit Vertrauen auf uns selbst, mit Klarheit in die wirtschaftlichen Gesetze und mit dem Willen zur Zusammenarbeit mit anderen Völkern an die schweren Aufgaben der Zukunft herantreten, dann werden wir sie lösen.
Ich habe aber nur so atmosphärisch die Erinnerung, mit welcher Sorge und welchem Bedenken mein Vater diese Machtübernahme durch Hitler aufnahm. Und es ist ja inzwischen auch bekannt, dass er versucht hat, in der Nacht im Leipziger Rathaus Wache zu halten, um zu verhindern, dass die nationalsozialistische Flagge aufgezogen wurde.
He was active, I think, since 35, 36, very active, trying to find people who would cooperate in order to stop Hitler, not already to kill him, but to stop him or bring him even to court.
Fritz Dietlif Count von der Schulenburg, a Nazi Party member with growing doubts, was Deputy Commissioner of Police in Berlin.
Für die Schulenburgs war natürlich der Erste Weltkrieg und seine Folgen. Wie eine dunkle Wolke hing das, glaube ich, über dem ganzen Haus. Mein Schwiegervater wurde ja auch deutschnationaler Reichstagsabgeordneter. Die Schulenburgs-Jungs alle, die wollten natürlich alle unbedingt Soldaten werden und in den Krieg. Und also besonders Fritzi, der nun 1918 erst 16 war, nicht? Hat dadurch also sein Ideal, als Soldat in den Krieg zu gehen, verpasst, ging aber ja dann ins Freikorps. Als ich ihn wieder traf, erzählte er mir, dass er in die Nationalsozialistische Partei eingetreten sei. Meinte eben, dass es doch zu hoffen und möglich sei, dass mit dieser Partei eben etwas Neues bewirkt werden könnte für die Republik Deutschland.
My brothers were fervent Nazis, and my brother Fritzi turned, well, in his heart he turned against Hitler in 1934. From 1936, 37 on, they were decided to put away with Hitler. I saw him after my father's death. Father had had a state burial with Hitler present. And it was then that he told me that he was, well, organizing the plot. He was in the plot to kill Hitler.
Major General Henning von Trescow, Operations Officer in Army Group Center on the Eastern Front.
Trescow entstammte einer alten preußischen Soldatenfamilie. Viele seiner Vorfahren waren Generale. Sie waren sehr national Preußen. 1930 hatte Trescow sicherlich mit Hitler sympathisiert. Hitler versprach eine soziale und eine nationale Regierung. National war Trescow selbstverständlich und auch den sozialen Ausgleich suchte er. Und so war ihm Hitler sympathisch. Er hat sich nicht näher mit ihm auseinandergesetzt, aber sein Programm war ihm sympathisch. Er hat nicht den Kampf gelesen. 1934 dann war er Adjutant im IR-9, im 1. Bataillon, und erlebte dort den Röhmputsch. Und von da an wurde er skeptisch gegenüber den Nazis.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Lutheran pastor and theologian. He came from a family that persisted in defying the Nazis' ideology and anti-Jewish decrees.
Dietrich, just by his personality and the way he behaved, he was the dominant figure. And that was his secret. He was such an independent mind, by education, by his past, by his theological and church training. Through him, the first shattering of my nationalistic views started. The first taking serious the Jewish problem in Nazi Germany.
By his example and his teaching, Bonhoeffer brought a small number of seminarians and pastors out of the established Lutheran Church and into a dissenting church, the Confessing Church. He insisted that Christianity demanded resistance to Nazism.
In the Confessing Church, we were against Hitler's church policy, but at the same time we were anti-Semites, not thinking of what later then really developed, and really blind in a way for what already had happened in 1933. But Bonhoeffer saw the danger when it came up and knew exactly what it meant in human terms. The question was, how can a Christian in Germany like him, being a member of a responsible kind of elite in Germany, how can he live without being drawn into complicity with the murder of the Jews? And how to draw yourself out of that complicity. That was the real problem, out of which he understood that he couldn't be near Christ, couldn't claim to be a disciple of Christ by just sitting away and become an accomplice of the murder legislation and the murder deeds. And for that, he opened my eyes, at least, and of several of us.
2 days after Hitler came to power, Dietrich Bonhoeffer broadcast a radio address decrying the Nazi Führerprinzip, the idea of an all-powerful leader. Jesus alone, he insisted, was the Christian's leader. His broadcast was cut off halfway through. Among the institutions which offered no opposition to Hitler were the established churches. A Nazi Lutheran bishop, Ludwig Müller, was installed in the Berlin Cathedral. In July 1933, a concordat was concluded between the Vatican and the German government, Hitler's first major international diplomatic success. Other successes followed. This sort of international recognition seemed to many to legitimize Hitler's absolute rule. With Hitler, a new Germany was born. The Reichstag was dissolved. Emergency ordinances gave the police the power to ban public meetings and to control the press. On March 23rd, the so-called Enabling Act was passed, removing all constitutional restraints on government power. On March 29th, the Social Democratic deputy, Julius Leber, was arrested at the entrance to the Reichstag and sent to one of the newly established concentration camps. The first laws abrogating the civil rights of Jews were passed. By mid-July 1933, all opposition parties were banned. Communist Party members were put into the camps.
This complete destruction of all opposition in the ordinary sense happened at once. Hitler was a very efficient person. He destroyed all the groups that were against him, all of them. And he did it very well. He took their leaders away, put them into concentration camp, and created fear.
Well, I don't think we understand police states. But in Germany, there was both this, the absolute tyranny. There also was the element of lawlessness, which the Nazis used and exploited, because they didn't respect the law and the due processes at all, and anything could happen to anybody. This feeling was very frightening. Well, it wasn't just a feeling, it was the reality that the Nazis had a grip on the place, and they would do anything, and did. And a large number of Germans were put in concentration camps. I think it's always forgotten how many were put inside in the very early days, when they just pushed in everybody who made trouble.
I remember Peter coming very back one night. He had defended a socialist who had been passing around illegal leaflets, and he'd got the man off. And they'd walked outside the law courts, he'd shaken him by the hand and turned round to wave as he got into his own car, and saw the man being bundled into a black Marat by police. And he'd spent the day looking for that man, finding out what had happened to that man, and had been told everywhere, had he not ever heard of preventive custody. I remember him coming into the house and saying, for me, there is no more law in this country, and this is not a country where we can bring up our children.
I'm wondering whether, in fact, my political development would have been different if I hadn't happened to have quite a number of close Jewish friends and contemporaries who worked for the legal exam at the same time as me. One passing the exam on the same day as me in May 1933. And my career could go on, and his couldn't. And if I hadn't experienced this number of friends and acquaintances suddenly being underprivileged, I'm not sure that I would have taken an interest in politics at all. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I would have or could have become one of those fellow travelers who didn't want to be bothered with any resistance against the regime and bought the party badge in order not to be molested by the Nazis, and as it happened to most people.
The Röhmputsch dispelled the last doubts about the criminality of the Nazi regime. Ernst Röhm headed a popular paramilitary force, the Brown Shirts, which Hitler saw as a possible rival for power. During the night of June 30th, 1934, thugs loyal to Hitler murdered Röhm and other Brown Shirt leaders. They also murdered 2 army brigadier generals. The army did not protest the crime.
Ich schwöre bei Gott, diesen heiligen Eid, dass ich dem Führer.
The integrity of the army was further eroded by an unconstitutional oath of personal loyalty to Hitler, which every German soldier was required to take.
Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler. Jederzeit für diesen Eid. Jederzeit für diesen Eid. Mein Leben einzusetzen. Mein Leben einzusetzen. Unser deutsches Reich und Volk. Sieg! Sieg! Sieg!
My father asked me, he said, you dislike Hitler, you think he's a criminal. How can you swear? And said, it wouldn't have been good, I would have been shot, and it would be useless. And he said, that's very dangerous, because if many people wouldn't have sworn, wouldn't have made their oath, nobody would have shot. But if everybody obeys order, then of course Hitler gets away with it. And I said, yes, but at the same time I made another oath in myself, and to break the official one as soon as and as much as I can. I said, yes, maybe, but this is utilism and dangerous.
In 1938, leading Nazis engineered the disgrace and removal of 2 senior generals, Fritsch and Blomberg, due to their opposition to Hitler's plans for war. When the army once again did not protest, a few officers, already disillusioned by the Röhmputsch and the Hitler Oath, were stirred into active resistance. One officer, who became more and more critical of the regime, was the young Prussian, Henning von Treschow.
Er erlebte dann 38 die Fritsch-Krise. Und nachdem die Generale nicht einschritten, was er gehofft hatte, beabsichtigte er, aus der Wehrmacht auszutreten. Witzleben, der damals schon ein Gegner Hitlers war, sagte, das wäre genau das, was sie nicht tun dürften. Man hätte nur Macht und könnte nur Macht gegen Hitler verwenden, wenn man in der Wehrmacht blieb. Treschow traf sich dann mit Beck, traf sich mit Oster, traf sich mit Gördler. Die Verschwörung begann Form anzunehmen.
Dr. Karl Gördler, the mayor of Leipzig, had briefly joined the Nazi government as Price Commissioner, believing that he could personally influence Hitler.
Meine Erinnerung hat er zwar 34 das Amt mit einer gewissen, ich würde heute fast sagen, Euphorie, was bewirken zu können, was ändern zu können, übernommen und ist dann 35 mit tiefer Resignation weggegangen und hatte das Gefühl, doch nicht mehr wirklich was tun zu können.
In April 1937, Dr. Gördler had resigned from the office of mayor in protest against the removal of the Mendelssohn Monument, carried out in his absence and against his explicit instructions by the Nazi deputy mayor.
Als mein Vater nun aus dem Amt als Oberbürgermeister ausgeschieden war, hat er es, so wie will mir heute scheinen, unheimlich schnell als seine Aufgabe angesehen, das Ausland für Hitler zu warnen.
And in all these things, Girdler was very much in it. New was one of the men who traveled to England, to different countries, and traveled in Germany itself, tireless, out of old conservative tradition, but certainly to try to bring about another Germany.
Von Beginn an eigentlich diese Auslandsreisen ansah als ein Mittel, das Ausland aufzuklären über einmal die Unrechtsstaatlichkeit im Inneren und über die doch recht kurzfristigen Kriegsabsichten Hitlers auf weitere Sicht, die das Ausland auch betreffen müssten.
The British Foreign Office simply told Girdler that what he was proposing amounted to treason. In March of 1938, Austria was incorporated into the German Reich. Although the international community protested, there was no retaliation. In addition, Hitler had already informed his ministers and generals that he intended to take over Czechoslovakia, even if it meant war. Hopes for stopping Hitler's evolving war plans were focused on Colonel General Ludwig Beck, Army Chief of Staff, who was planning a military coup.
There was the definite feeling that the generals were going to do something. They were going to arrest him. It was not murder. It was not assassination.
Hans Dohnanyi had collected a chronicle of scandals when he was still in the office of the Ministry of Law, of the Ministry of Justice, and had collected all the scandal facts in certain files in order to present that in a trial to the German public in case Hitler would be stopped and brought to trial.
I don't think my father was very happy with his alliance with military people in general. He was a convinced civilian. He hated any kind of uniform, etc. And yet these were the necessary and inevitable allies. I mean, the only way to change the German government in the period between 1933 and 1945 from the inside was with the military and not against them.
In order to act, Colonel Generals Beck, Halder, and the vacillating Field Marshal von Brauchitsch needed to know that the British would fight rather than give in to Hitler's demands and would not interfere in a German military coup. As the Sudeten crisis deepened, General Beck arranged to send the elder Kleist to London to warn the British of the planned invasion of Czechoslovakia. General Beck told Kleist, "Bring me certain proof that Britain will fight if Czechoslovakia is attacked, and I will make an end of this regime." But the Chamberlain government dismissed Kleist's reports and implied that he was a traitor. Kleist's meeting with Winston Churchill also achieved nothing. The British would not respond, even when Theo Kort came from the German Foreign Ministry's permanent Undersecretary of State, Ernst von Weizsäcker, with an appeal for stiff resistance to Hitler.
The whole disaster of the court mission is only explicable on those terms. They couldn't understand it. They couldn't believe that Weizsäcker was sending somebody to tell them how to frustrate his own government. They couldn't believe that. If court comes and says the military are ready to arrest Hitler if you don't give way over the Sudetenland, and if Halifax didn't believe him, he should have sent somebody to Germany to find out. And this idea of intriguing with the army was quite foreign to them, and there was no department of state that was ready to deal with that. It wasn't diplomacy, it wasn't military intelligence. It didn't fit into anybody's duty.
The British government, with the French, were working hard to come to a peaceful accommodation with Hitler.
have another talk with Herr Hitler. Only this time, he has told me that it is his intention to come halfway to meet me.
Ich glaube, das hat ihn unheimlich immer wieder beschäftigt, dass ein Herr Daladier und ein Herr Chamberlain sich so viel Sand in die Augen streuen ließen. Und ich höre ihn so ausdrücken, so kriechen die sogar zu dem Hitler.
In September 1938, Britain, France, and Italy met in Munich with Hitler and signed an agreement that the Sudetenland be annexed to Germany. They accepted Hitler's promise that he had no further territorial ambitions beyond the Sudetenland. The warnings of Kleist, Gerdler, Kort, and others were ignored. The best opportunity for a coup had been lost.
One really good opportunity was before Munich. At that time, there was the ideal conditions in that there was great doubt in Germany that Hitler wouldn't get them into trouble if he went on into the Sudetenland. The army was poised to do something about it, and all Britain had to do was to not agree. And had that happened, there was a good chance that it would have brought about the downfall of the regime. After that, there wasn't such an opportunity.
Abandoned by the French and the British, the Czechs put up no resistance to Hitler. The Sudetenland was annexed to the Reich without war. Hitler had won his gamble. Failing to stop Hitler's progression towards war, General Beck resigned from the army on August 19, 1938.
At that time, there was great fear in Germany of going into a war. I mean, I do know that because I went there at that time, and it was very evident that people thought, is this man mad? Where's he taking us to? But when he got away with that, and there was no reaction to him not only taking the Sudetenland, but later on going into Prague and taking that, well, then it became almost impossible to say, for the army to move in and say, well, this man doesn't estimate rightly, he's going to land you in a world war, because he did estimate rightly, and he got away with these things.
Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. On November 9th, 1938, less than 2 months after the Munich conference, Nazi troopers were sent on a nationwide, window-smashing, fire-setting rampage against the Jews.
Ich habe das so erlebt, dass ganz früh am Morgen des 9. November der Graf Paul York, also der ältere Bruder von Peter, ungefähr um 6 morgens zu uns kam und zu meinem Mann sagte, du musst jetzt mitkommen, wir müssen in die Stadt fahren, es sind entsetzliche Dinge passiert in der Nacht. Und dann sind die beide weggefahren und mein Mann ist spät am Abend, ganz spät am Abend wiedergekommen, völlig erschöpft, völlig erschüttert und überwältigt auch. So habe ich das erlebt und ich hatte natürlich am Tag dann gehört, was passiert war in Berlin. Und ich glaube, das war das Furchtbarste für ihn, dass er eben auf so einem Polizeiposten war und doch nichts machen konnte.
After Kristallnacht, Count von der Schulenburg's resistance activities intensified. Through his contacts with the Gestapo, he managed to help Jewish people to leave Berlin. In 1940, he joined the 9th Infantry Regiment, in which Axel von dem Busche was a lieutenant.
It's a strange regiment, 9th Infantry in Potsdam. After the war, it was on record, and still is, of course, of having produced more officers hung, killed, shot by Hitler and his legal machine than any other unit of the army. So there was some sort of thing in that regiment there was some sort of proportion still left, what could be done and not. To give you an example, this regiment was part of the 23rd Division around Berlin. The commanding general was a man called Brockdorf Ahlefeld. His nickname in the troop was Bony Charles, Knochenkerl. And Bony Charles, when he heard what was going on in Berlin with regard to synagogues and more than Jew baiting, Jew chasing and Jew chasing, that's an understatement still, he put the whole division under alert, thinking and believing he would get orders to march to pacify what he still thought was a genuine mob pogrom. So we couldn't get out. And the next day, the alert was stopped. And gradually, over the years, we heard why he had put the division under alert. He had thought he would get orders to march into Berlin and stop this. And the Supreme Command of the Army stood by with silence, as they had on June 30th, 1934. They could easily have squashed it, but nobody gave the orders, and an army will only march if it gets orders. Next morning, my colleague, Henrik Bodmer, said, well, it was all staged. And I said, what exactly do you mean by staged? Well, he said the police were ordered to stand by, and the fire brigades were ordered to stand by, and these stormtroopers were allowed to put fire and smash the windows of Jewish shops. And it's perhaps an interesting point to note that in 1937 in November, a man with my background wouldn't think that is conceivable. Couldn't imagine. It sort of started to fall into focus. The pattern became gradually clear. But every time something like that happened, one had to adjust one's insight into the possibility of human beings. 1937, I was 18 years of age, and I suppose I came from a more or less cuddled background. But the dimension of organized, stimulated crime is something which sinks very slowly into a brain of an 18 or 19-year-old boy. It just, you can't believe it. You've got to open some new dimensions of understanding.
In March 1939, the German army marched into Prague, and the Czech part of Free Czechoslovakia was incorporated into the Nazi Empire. A second world war was now imminent, and in time of war, those who chose loyalty to conscience over loyalty to their government would be branded as traitors.
Now, Adam at that time was thinking, he was looking at the situation from the outside. He was wondering, is there any international combination that could do anything to prevent a war?
Trott became an emissary for the resistance and traveled to England in 1939.
Adam, he wanted me to help him when he reached the British government. And he met Halifax at my parents' house. And Halifax encouraged Trott to talk. And there was a room full of people. And so he had to be fairly circumspect. But he did talk, and he said, there is a great unwillingness to go into a world war for Hitler amongst many people, army officers, people in the Foreign Office, but they have no means of stopping it now. And they need some sort of lead from outside.
People who didn't know him really well, intimately, wouldn't know what he would really stand for and would have doubts what he would be standing for. And as a result of that, he here and there has been misinterpreted in Oxford, particularly at his last meeting with his friends in Oxford, when he, in fact, couldn't tell them what he thought his job was, because Oxford is a talking shop, and it would find its way back to the knowledge of the wrong people in Germany.
In 1940, Adam von Trott joined the Foreign Office, a position which he used as a cover for his continuing resistance activities. In order to get the appointment, he had to join the Nazi Party.
Trott had an especially difficult task because he had always outwardly to pretend that he was positive about the regime because he couldn't have traveled otherwise. And so the people here thought he was a Nazi. And they couldn't, but this all comes out of the difficulty to understand what it is to like to live in a dictatorship. A dictatorship of that kind, or how you cannot disagree, how in a totalitarian state like that, disagreement, legal disagreement is not possible. And that was not understood.
Trott went to Washington and again met with mistrust. The FBI followed him everywhere. President Roosevelt would not meet with him after he received a report from Britain that Trott was not to be trusted.
They did not recognize that there were other Germans, and this was Adam's mission, which he took with him wherever, at risk of his life, wherever he went. To Sweden now, to America, to Sweden, to Switzerland. But his messages were continuously coming out from all directions at danger to his life. There are other Germans. There is another Germany.
Just as World War II was about to erupt, the Dutch military attaché in Berlin, Colonel G.J. Sass, received a message from a member of German military intelligence, Lieutenant Colonel Hans Oster.
We got information from Oster, who told us that there were attempts on foot to overthrow the Nazi regime. Colonel Oster provided Sass with almost daily, day-to-day information about Hitler's plans to attack first Poland, then Holland, Belgium and France, and subsequently Denmark, Norway and England.
Mein Vater, hat schriftlich niedergelegt, dass nicht verlangt, dass Menschen diesen Schritt verstehen. Hat aber seine Freunde gebeten, dass sie ihn verstehen möchten, dass diesen Schritt getan hat, dass trotzdem sich einbildet, ein anständiger Mensch geblieben zu sein und dass das ganz alleine verantworten wird vor seinem Herrgott und dazu auch bereit ist.
General Oster risked his life because if it had been known what he was doing and what secrecy he was betraying, he certainly would have been the end of him. They said, I cannot believe that a high German officer gives away such valuable secrets to potential enemy. And in the end, the people who received the messages laughed about it. But when the attack came, it was too late. They were not sufficiently prepared.
Voller Entsetzen kam mein Mann von einer Dienstreise zurück nach Bukarest und sagte zu mir, die Leute sind völlig besoffen in Deutschland wegen der Siege in Frankreich. Und selbst Vater hört plötzlich die Wehrmachtsberichte und freut sich über die Erfolge der deutschen Wehrmacht.
With the fall of France, many army officers who might once have opposed Hitler were caught up in the pressure of wartime duties and the elation of easy victory. Only the few, with deep convictions, remained committed to resistance, which now seemed more difficult than ever.
I recall the very desperate expressions and words of my father on the very day on which Paris was conquered. To swim against public opinion in your own country in times of victory is a difficult thing to do.
Welches Volk bringen Sie zum Sturz seiner Regierung, wenn die Regierung selbst einen Erfolg nach dem anderen aufzuweisen hat?
Helmut had a terrific depression when France was taken and when Hitler was really at the top. He had a depression that he felt ill and he didn't think of committing suicide, but he felt, what was it all good to live for if this was it? And then, and that point I always make, because it played a big role in that group, he sort of pulled himself out of this depression by making a point of talking to other people who were anti-Nazis about what would happen in the future when the Nazis were gone. And then he became quite systematic. And the person who helped him there become systematic was Peter Jong. Peter brought in the ones that were in the Foreign Office. There were two, that Adam von Trotze-Solz and Hans Bernd von Haften. And Hans Bernd von Haften also brought in the element of civil service and Christianity. Then we had a man called Schulenburg, Fritz Schulenburg. He was a civil servant under the Nazis and changed his mind. And he was very much for getting the military to act against Hitler. Helmut made that great effort to get socialists in, and of course that he only could do because of his own leanings. And one of the socialists who were very much anti-Hitler was Julius Leber, who had been in concentration camp for years, and then came out. He knew about the Kreisau. But first of all, Helmut got Reichwein, and he brought other socialists to the group.
Reichwein hat die Sozialisten Mierendorf und Haubach zugeführt. Und Mierendorf wurde ja dann von Moltke sehr geschätzt. Er hielt ihn für einen wirklichen Volksführer. Er konnte wunderbar Volksreden halten. Beide waren Reichstagsabgeordnete früher gewesen und beide waren schon mal im KZ gewesen. Und als dann nachher Mierendorf von einer Bombe getroffen wurde, war das für den Kreis ein ganz großer Verlust. Und da sprang dann Julius Leber ein.
There were differences of opinion. There were people thinking more along traditional conservative lines, others who would concentrate, including Moltke and Labour, concentrating very much on the idea of a united Europe, especially Western Europe. But they also thought that there might be chances for some larger European cooperation, including larger changes in Russia and in Eastern Europe.
Die Kreisauer lebten in der Vorstellung, dass zwar die kapitalistische Weltordnung von uns nicht einfach umgekippt werden könne, dass aber auf der anderen Seite doch zwischen Kapitalismus und Sozialismus begehbare Brücken gefunden werden müssten, installiert werden müssten.
This loose alliance of socialists, conservatives, army officers, civil servants, and clergymen met frequently to lay plans for their vision of a post-war Germany, a constitutional state within a federated European Union. Because they sometimes met at Kreisau, von Moltke's estate in Silesia, the Gestapo would name them the Kreisau Circle. In autumn of 1940, the 9th Infantry Regiment, which had participated in the invasion of France, was moved back to Poland.
We were moved with occupation troops in an industrial rural city on the Vistula between Warsaw and Danzig. And all the civil servants of the civil government were out in their brown uniforms and chasing the Jews out of their dwellings into a prepared part of the city which was a ghetto. But again, there was no mob. This was an organized action. You've seen things like Jew baiting on November the 9th, 40, or whether you hear at the same time that there is a planned extermination of an intellectual middle and upper class of a formerly sovereign neighbor nation. You couldn't believe it. I mean, conceptual you want to follow, even if you are very young, conceptual you want to follow. And you can't get at the concept. What philosophy is that? And what good does it do? No. One went and did one's day-to-day duty to get the food up and the battalions fed and exercises planned, and one just started with keeping a curtain down. One started to keep a curtain down towards these news.
Throughout the war, a number of Jews were enabled to leave Germany, aided by a group of resistors working within the Nazi military intelligence service, the Abwehr. The Abwehr was headed by the chief of military intelligence, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who continued to work for the Nazi regime while providing cover and assistance for the resistors within his organization. Colonel Oster was Canaris' chief of staff.
Mein Vater hat ja laufend immer im Wechsel mit dem Admiral Canaris jüdische Menschen mit Hilfe falscher Papiere von der Abwehr ins Ausland befördert, beziehungsweise ihnen die Papiere überbracht am Bahnhof Zoo. Das war immer ein bestimmter Zug, abends gegen 10. Und da ging er immer, in Zivil natürlich.
One initiative of the Abwehr was Operation U-7, which sent some Jews out of the country on the pretext that they were intelligence agents. Dr. Fliess and his family were included in one of these rescue efforts.
We had to wear the star. That began in 41 in September, and the first deportation started around September and October 41. And then we got that letter that we had to be prepared for deportation. And then Donani said, look, Herr von Moltke and I have decided we will do something to help you and your family. It will be too dangerous, you won't survive. He was quite clear about that. It took us half a year, even more, to go out. We only left on the 30th of September. It took quite some time. It was very complicated. All these preparations, probably, the money, everything. And to get the passports. I never knew how Donani managed to do that. It's incredible. And Donani was so terribly depressed because of his country. And then I remember that my father tried to cheer him up and said, look, there are other people, not all of them are like that, and that will pass. And then we'll all talk about it.
The Canaris organization had recruited the young jurist Hans von Donani and the pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Dietrich was given a passport by the Canaris organization and went 3-4 times to Switzerland. He went to Norway and to Sweden to meet the Bishop of Chichester, in those days Bishop George Bell, who in the name of the conspiracy even visited Anthony Eden, in those days foreign minister, and reported him what he had heard from Schönfeld and especially from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and how credible he was. Of course, Anthony Eden remained suspicious.
My dear Bishop, without casting any reflection on the bona fides of your informants, I am satisfied that it would not be in the national interest for any reply whatever to be sent to them. I realize that this decision may cause you some disappointment, but in view of the delicacy of the issues involved, I feel that I must ask you to accept it. Yours sincerely, Anthony Eden.
And to me it always seemed extraordinarily strange that the British recognized the Maquis, the Yugoslavs, the Greeks. They recognized opposition everywhere, but never recognized that there was a German opposition.
Helmut von Moltke also found cover in the Abwehr under Canaris and traveled to seek support and recognition for the resistance.
Moltke particularly wanted very badly for us to help him establish contacts with London.
He did try quite systematically to get in touch with the resistance in other countries, because he felt again that this was the same issue, and then one had to try and get to know them, because they would be the people who later on would govern those countries. And he had some success he had quite a lot of success in Holland and in Scandinavia, in Norway.
He brought us documents about things particularly pertaining to the resistance in Germany, and as I believe I mentioned earlier, the whole material from the White Rose.
In February 1943, a student resistance movement surfaced briefly in Munich, calling itself the White Rose. Inspired by the sermons of the Catholic Bishop von Galen, Hans Scholl and his sister Sophie and a small circle of Munich University students printed and distributed leaflets calling on the German people to resist the Nazi government and the war. The British constantly demanded concrete evidence that a German resistance existed. Helmut von Moltke sent the proclamations of the White Rose to London through the Norwegian underground movement. Hans and Sophie Scholl and the others were quickly caught and arrested. They were tried, sentenced to death, and decapitated. The evidence of their resistance was ignored by the Allies, despite Moltke's efforts.
Count Moltke also, he warned us against the action against the Jews. He had been in touch with an officer who was stationed at a place near a concentration camp. And this officer had told him, and he said that I'm absolutely certain that this is true, that at this concentration camp, people were killed at the rate of 6,000 per day.
When Dietrich Bonhoeffer in September 41 saw Dr. Wilhelm Visser-Toft, the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches in Geneva, Visser-Toft asked him what he was just praying now, and he said and answered clearly, I pray for the defeat of my country, because that's the only way we can pay for all the atrocities we did in the world.
Ich habe mich erst dazu durchringen konnte, Hitler auf dem Wege des Mordes aus der Welt zu schaffen.
And the actual act of getting rid of Hitler was certainly, to my mind, amongst all those conspirators, a matter of great doubt as to how it should happen. Should it happen? With Moltke was very much against anything of that kind. And Adam himself was very, very doubtful to actually order somebody or collaborate with somebody who would shoot the man.
Nur ist das eine andere Sache, ob Sie so etwas theoretisch wissen oder ob Sie das Gefühl haben, Mensch, also du musst ja selber dabei mit antreten. Es ist keine Entscheidung zu fragen, warum denn gerade ich? War mir sehr unsympathisch, aber ich war jedenfalls also der Meinung, hör mal, also dieses ganze Gefackel ist weder rühmlich noch ehrbar noch sonst etwas, solange du nicht entschlossen bist, selber mit Hand anzulegen. Solange du das nur von anderen, von Generalen zum Beispiel, erwartest.
And it was actually this fear, this impression of the imminent danger for so many people that led my father to try to do things which are not easy to do. I mean, to make a decision to kill somebody is a difficult decision by political assassination.
Erstens war er überzeugt, dass man als Christ ja eigentlich die Gebote halten müsste und selbst in den schwierigsten Lagen, dass man sich da nicht einfach freimachen könnte von dem Gebot des Du sollst nicht töten. Andererseits erkannte er dann doch allmählich, dass man den Tyrannen doch beseitigen muss, so oder so.
Of course it's true you shall not kill, but you had killed already. You had killed since 1933. In your name, Jews were being killed, and you had to stop the murderer. You have to be prepared to accept the guilt of, because you much earlier have failed. The failure was not killing Hitler. The failure was accepting 1933 anti-Jewish legislation and Nazism. That was the real guilt, against which now stopping that man who in your name killed thousands and millions of co-citizens, yeah, that was the guilt you had to take on you and ask for forgiveness, but you have to do it.
Moltke said, wir wollen Europa vom Tyrannen befreien.
In June 1941, the German army invaded the Soviet Union, violating their mutual non-aggression pact. The 9th Infantry Regiment moved with other army units from Poland into the Ukraine. At first, the Ukrainians welcomed the German army as liberators. But then Hitler gave administrative control of all captured territories in the east to the Nazi party-run Commissariat East and to the black uniformed SS. And the stage was set for the bloodiest, most vicious campaign of the war. Captain Busche was stationed in Dubno, training soldiers near an unused airport.
Now, the airport was about 200 yards away through some shrubbery, so I walked out and there was this fantastic moment where I collected my wits to understand it. There were these big holes which I never understood, and there was this one enormously long queue of naked human beings queuing up to that hole. And at the end of the queue, trucks came, unloaded human beings. They obviously undressed there, and the clothes were put in the trucks again and drove off. And this queue of naked people sort of went step after step nearer to these holes. And then I saw that on the edges of the holes there were some types sitting in black uniforms and shooting into the holes. And it took me some time to get that together, to see, to understand that here was extermination going on, extermination of Jews. Takes some time. You don't understand it first. So I turned around and went to the colonel and said, Colonel, we've got to do something. And he said, I have to see first. We went out again. And he saw it and came to the conclusion that if we marched in, we would be shot down next day as mutineers by some very modern equipped battalion in Vinica, the headquarters of Adolf Hitler. This went on for 2 days. They shot approximately 1,800 human beings out there in that circumstance. And no interference from our side. It's a moment where the bottom of everything falls out and keeps away, you know, keeps away. If we, German soldiers, looking at this mass extermination, had concluded quickly that undressing and queuing up voluntarily in this queue of naked people, men, children, young women, old women, young men, old women, I believe we would have stopped it. If the whole army had walked in like that, it would not have happened. Therefore, there is an element of self-blame that it didn't occur to me. It occurred to me after the war that the only feasible solution in the moment is putting yourself into the same situation and see what happens. Didn't occur to me. And instinctively, I knew, and all of them who watched it knew, some kind of traditional accepted harmony has been destroyed here. And we've been witness, we've seen it, but we were not able to put it in words. We were not able to put it in words, nor in thoughts, nor in a logical deduction. This is what we have to do. Something was shattered there. We have to start from scratch. You can repair political affairs, but you cannot repair once that innocence has gone. That self-understood innocence about interhuman matters, that has gone. And I can only repeat what that bishop said a couple of days ago. It is my responsibility and guilt that I am still alive, period.
By winter of 1942, the resistors within the military, the Abwehr, and the civilian circles in Berlin made plans to assassinate Hitler, believing this to be the only means of stopping the war and the atrocities. Throughout 42 and 43, one of the focal points for all active resistance within the military was the Army Group Center in Smolensk on the Eastern Front. It was led by Colonel Henning von Tresckow, who had filled the command staff with anti-Nazis. All Trescow's attempts to involve his superior officers in the conspiracy had failed. Generals Field Marshal von Bock, Field Marshal von Kluge, and Field Marshal von Manstein increasingly took refuge in strict military duty, thereby ignoring the atrocities which were being committed.
Stahlberg hat das Manstein erzählt, dass bei ihm 250.000 Juden umgebracht worden sind. Manstein hat gesagt, nein, das ist unmöglich. Das sind ja so viele wie im Olympiastadion in Berlin, das hätten wir gehört. Nein, nein, das ist, lassen Sie sich doch von Ihren Freunden nicht dumme Sachen erzählen. Das war die Antwort von Manstein. Im Gegensatz zu Kluge und im Gegensatz zu Tresckow. Mit solchen Sachen will ich nichts zu tun haben. Was ich nicht weiß, geht mich nichts an.
By the end of 1942, Tresckow and his group were the only ones with the capacity or resolve to kill Hitler.
Ein Attentat war sehr schwer durchzuführen für Leute, die an der Front waren, weil Hitler war zu feige, er ging nicht an die Front. Schließlich glückte es aber Tresckow, Hitler zur Heeresgruppe Mitte zu bringen.
The conspirators made their first coordinated attempt on Hitler's life in March 1943. Admiral Canaris flew from Berlin to Smolensk in advance, carrying a box of explosives, a commodity difficult to acquire in wartime Germany. The admiral was accompanied by Colonel Oster and Hans von Donani of the Abwehr Group. The conspirators agreed that Tresco would carry out the assassination in Smolensk and then send the code word Flash to Donani in Berlin as a signal for the coup to begin.
Damals hat dann Tresco mit Schlaberdorf zusammen ein Attentat trotzdem noch durchgeführt, indem er 2 Bomben als Cognacflaschen getarnt in das Flugzeug von Hitler hineinschmuggelte.
Just as Hitler's plane was departing Smolensk, after his meeting with Tresco, Schlabrendorf gave the bottles to a Hitler aide, saying they were meant for a friend in Berlin. The bombs were set to go off in half an hour.
Man wusste ganz genau, das hatte man vorher ausprobiert, wie lange die Zündung lief, bis die Bombe explodierte. Und man wartete nach einer halben Stunde auf die Meldung, dass die Flugzeuge abstürzten. Das Flugzeug von Hitler abstürzte. Es war schon Alarm gegeben worden für im Reich, weil die ganzen Planungen liefen darauf, dass, wenn Hitler tot war, sofort Kasernen besetzt wurden, Ministerien besetzt wurden und so. Diese Planung war ausgelöst worden, weil man sicher war, dass das Flugzeug abstürzt. Aber Hitler landete wohlbehalten in seinem Hauptquartier. Die Bombe hatte nicht gezündet.
A week later, Tresco organized another attempt, this time to take place in Berlin on Heroes Memorial Day.
Der Führer begibt sich zum Zeughaus der historischen Weihestätte deutschen Soldatentums. Der Reichsmarschall. Generalfeldmarschall Keitel, Großadmiral Dönitz, Reichsführer SS Himmler, Generalfeldmarschall von Bock, Generalfeldmarschall Milch, Reichskriegsopferführer Oberlin-Ober.
As part of the ceremony, Hitler was to view an exhibition of captured war material in the Zeughaus, accompanied by Colonel von Gersdorf. As he waited for Hitler, Gersdorf activated 2 bombs he had in his pockets, setting them to explode in less than 10 minutes. Contrary to expectations, Hitler raced through the exhibition and did not stop for explanations. He continued to walk briskly and left the exhibit after a few minutes. Another attempt had failed.
Der Führer verlässt das Zeughaus.
Yet another assassination was attempted by Lieutenant von dem Busche, who witnessed the massacre in Dubno and now volunteered to kill himself and carry Hitler with him.
I knew what is commonly called conspirators in that regiment. And I went up as soon as I could and reported this and said, now we've got to shoot him. Because unless that army and this government gets free from this bondage of this oath they think they are linked to like a lasso to that government, unless we kill number 1, we can't start even reorganizing and stopping this. And I went to Fritzi Schulenburg. And Schulenburg said, there is a man whom I consider the most gifted general staff officer I've ever seen, and he wants to see a type like you. And he brought me to Stauffenberg, to his office. Then he says, well, you are infantry, you've got battle experience, we need a man to blow the man up. He was quite frank. And I was picked up to introduce new uniforms to Adolf Hitler, Goering and Himmler, who didn't come together very often, and blow them up. And then one of these things happen, which do happen if a man is supposed to live to his end, like Hitler. The uniforms ready to be shown in general headquarters in East Prussia were destroyed or partly destroyed by British bombing in Berlin in the night. And we couldn't go ahead with presenting this half-burnt-out material, so it didn't take place in November 43. It was postponed till early 44, and meanwhile they had shot my leg into pieces in Russia and I couldn't partake, so there I am.
Ever hopeful, Schulenburg and Stauffenberg approached Lieutenant von Kleist and asked him if he would volunteer to blow himself up with Hitler.
I found it a very difficult decision, I must say. And therefore I said to Stauffenberg, I would like to think 24 hours about it. From Berlin I took again a train, went home, and arrived the next morning, and my father said, why are you here again? And I said, well, there are difficult decisions I have to make. And he said, what is it? And I told him. And he said at once, yes, of course you have to do it. And I said, yes, but I have to blow up with Hitler. And he got up from his chair, went to the window, looked out of the window for a moment, and then he turned and said, yes, you have to do that. A man who doesn't take such a chance will never be happy again in his life.
Moskau bedroht das Reich. Der Führer trifft im Hauptquartier des Heeres ein.
Kleist's plan failed, as had other attempts, due to Hitler's habit of changing his schedule at the last minute. There was not much time left in which to act. Himmler's SS security police were closing in on the conspiracy. Helmut von Moltke had just been arrested after his name had been divulged by a fellow resistor who was tortured by the Gestapo. In April of 1943, the rescue operation of Jews conducted by the resistance network within the Abwehr had been uncovered, and Canaris, Oster, Donani, and Bonhoeffer had been arrested. In early summer of 1944, Julius Leber and Adolf Reichwein were picked up after meeting with members of the Communist Party, which was heavily infiltrated by informers. With so many conspirators in the hands of the Gestapo, the remainder were in imminent danger of exposure and death. At this point, when so little time was left to them, Stauffenberg was appointed Chief of Staff to General Fromm, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Army. This gave the increasingly vulnerable conspirators another chance to assassinate Hitler. For the first time, the resistance had a man with personal access to Hitler, and the stage was set for the attempt in the Führer's headquarters, Wolfschanze. A few days before the 20th of July, Stauffenberg said, "It is now time that something was done. But he who has the courage to do something must do it in the knowledge that he will go down in German history as a traitor. If he does not do it, however, he will be a traitor to his own conscience."
Stauffenberg was a fascinating personality. Maybe he had a burning heart, if you would permit me this expression. On the other hand, he was very cool in his plans, and personally charming, very friendly, and it was nice to make jokes with him. And I was extremely fond of him, I must say. Not only fond, but also impressed. And I had the feeling that he really was the best man we could have had to make the thing go.
He had a brilliant mind and a shattering laughter. He could laugh. I've never heard anybody laugh like that.
Stauffenberg erinnere ich genau zum Beispiel nach dem Polenfeldzug, als die begeisterte junge Offiziere zurückkamen aus dem Polenfeldzug. Da hat uns ein Freund von Stauffenberg und er mal nach dem Polenfeldzug einen Vortrag gehalten über diesen unglaublichen Siegeszug, der sie selber natürlich berauscht hat, nicht? Als große Kriegsleistung. Und ich meine, da war er so himmelweit entfernt, man konnte gar nicht denken, dass dieser Offizier, der da so begeistert, also für Hitler in den Krieg gegangen war, eines Tages sich zum Attentäter entwickeln. Das war ein weiter Weg von 39 bis 44.
At that time, Stauffenberg was working closely with Schulenburg, preparing the assassination attempt at Hitler's headquarters. Before the attempt, Schulenburg went home once more.
Er kam am 18. abends mit dem Zug aus Berlin nach Schwerin. Er hatte mir eigentlich versprochen, da ich ja am 20. Geburtstag habe, dieses Jahr nun vielleicht zum Geburtstag mal da zu sein. Aber stattdessen rief der Bahnhofswirt von Schwerin uns am Abend vom 18. an und sagte, der Graf ist eben mit dem Zug gekommen, er ist schon zu Fuß unterwegs nach Trevow, die Kinder sollen geweckt werden und der Geburtstag wird heute gefeiert. Und da machten wir natürlich weg, weil die Kinder, also ich sprang ins Auto, wir hatten so einen kleinen DKW noch, ne, für die Gutszwecke und fuhr ihm entgegen. Da kam er schon angewandert auf der Chaussee von Schwerin nach Trevow, das waren ungefähr 15 Kilometer. Und ich sah ihn ganz zuletzt, weil so Sommerzeit war es noch so dämmerig und die graue Uniform und das verschwand alles. Und stoppte vor ihm und sprang aus dem Wagen, da kam er an und sagte, jetzt geht's über die Bühne. Das war sein erstes Wort. Ich kann natürlich nicht am 20. kommen, aber ich bin ja heute da und so. Und wir fuhren also nach Hause, die Kinder sprangen in Nachthemden rum. Mein Geburtstagstisch wurde aufgebaut, höchst geheimnisvoll. War aber sehr schön und festlich. Und wir feierten wundervoll. Am nächsten Morgen um 7 musste er, also sagte er, ich muss morgen Vormittag schon wieder in Berlin sein, bei meinen Freunden am 19. Die warten auf mich, die wollten mich eigentlich gar nicht weglassen, aber nun bin ich also doch gekommen und jetzt muss ich morgen früh wieder hinfahren. Er fuhr um 7 mit dem Yachtwagen weg, ich brachte ihn an die Bahn und unterwegs sagte er zu mir, du weißt, dass es 50-50 ist. Also halbe Chance. Und ich dachte natürlich nur an die gute 50, an die gute Hälfte. Und dann sprang er also in den Zug und winkte noch furchtbar lange. Und da habe ich ihn eben zum letzten Mal gesehen.
In the early morning of July 20th, Stauffenberg and Lieutenant Werner von Haften flew to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia for a conference. In his briefcase, Stauffenberg carried 2 bombs.
In der Wolfschanze, also dem Hauptquartier Hitlers, hat der Graf Stauffenberg die Bombe während der Besprechung platziert und kurz vor 1 erfolgte die Explosion.
Before joining Hitler's conference, Stauffenberg retired to the lavatory to fuse the 2 bombs in his briefcase. Hampered by severe wounds, he had lost an eye and a hand and 2 fingers of the other hand, and being interrupted by a call to join the conference, he managed to fuse only 1 bomb, thereby reducing the force of the explosion by half. Stauffenberg entered the briefing room, inching his way as close as he could to Hitler. He put his briefcase with the bomb next to the map table's leg, and shortly after left under a pretext of making a phone call. Stauffenberg and Haften saw the explosion as they were leaving for the airport. 4 people were killed. Others were wounded. Hitler received only minor injuries.
Stauffenberg dringend in Berlin benötigt war. Ohne ihn glaubte man, den Staatsstreich nicht durchführen zu können. Und er war auf dem Rückweg. Und dann telefonierte er von dort in die Bendlerstraße und sagte, Herr Hitler ist tot, sofort alles anlaufen lassen. Denn bis dahin waren die Befehle zur Walküre-Aktion noch nicht rausgegeben worden.
Walküre was an emergency order prepared for the Hitler government, kept locked in a vault in the Bendlerstrasse, army headquarters in Berlin. The order had been secretly tailored by the conspirators to launch their coup. It called on army units to march on Berlin, ordered that Nazi government ministers be relieved of their duties, SS and Gestapo officers and concentration camp commandants to be arrested, and the camps immediately opened. At 1:15 p.m., Stauffenberg and Lieutenant Werner von Haften boarded a plane for Berlin, convinced that Hitler was dead. Within the first hour after the explosion, the chief of the Central Department for Capital Crimes, Dr. Bernd Wehner, was summoned to go on a mission.
Ja, dann bekam er einen Anruf von der Adjutantur von Newe, dem Chef der deutschen Kripo. Er müsse sofort zum Flugplatz mit Kaltenbrunner wegfliegen. Und da hieß es also auch nicht, ich muss ins Führerhauptquartier fahren, wenn Sie müssen sich also sehr stark beeilen. Der Gruppenführer wartet schon auf Sie. Und dann bin ich also zum Flughafen. Und da hat also Kaltenbrunner eigentlich in aller Ruhe uns erwartet. Und erst in der Maschine hieß es, ach so, die Männer von Newe wissen ja noch gar nicht, was los ist. Da ist die Schweinerei im Führerhauptquartier, der Führer ist tot. Der Führer ist tot, hieß es. Und dann kam also unmittelbar hinterher vom Chef der Sicherheitspolizei in der SSD, man muss sich das also vorstellen, kam also unmittelbar hinterher die Frage, wer spielt einen Skat mit? Und das war also eine makabre Situation. Der Führer ist tot, einem Attentat zum Opfer gefallen, wie sich dann also nur in dem Gespräch herausstellt. Und vorne sitzt der höchste Chef der Sicherheitspolizei und des SD, also der Polizei, und spielt Skat. Da kam also der Befehl, die Maschine soll sofort zur Feldkommandostelle Reichsführer SS fliegen. Dies sollte sein das Hauptquartier vom Reichsführer SS und Chef der deutschen Polizei in der Nähe gewesen. Und flog dort an. Und dort erwartete uns also Himmler schon. Wir stiegen also aus und dann hieß es, Kaltenbrunner, eine dicke Schweinerei, in Berlin ist die Revolution im Gange, Sie müssen sofort mit mir nach Berlin zurück. Sind wir dann weiter ins Führerhauptquartier geflogen.
When Stauffenberg and Werner von Haften arrived at last at the Bendlerstrasse, they found that the Walküre orders had not been issued. Precious hours had been lost. General Beck was already there with Fritz von der Schulenburg and Peter York. Dr. Eugen Gerstenmaier arrived shortly afterwards. Hans Bernd von Haften, Werner's brother, was waiting for orders with Adam von Trott at the Foreign Office. The young officers of the 9th Infantry Regiment were waiting at the Esplanade Hotel to be called into action. Among them, Hammerstein, Kleist, and Georg von Appen. Stauffenberg, meanwhile, was constantly on the phone, trying to move the coup forward.
Normally, I think there is a certain weight on the skin through the air. I don't know why, it's a physical miracle to me, but anyhow, it's a fact. On such a day, you have the impression that it's 100,000 times the weight which you normally carry. It's a fantastic atmosphere when the history is belling on the edge of a knife. Extremely difficult to describe. And interesting to watch the people who act in such a day, according to their characters and to their abilities. And here again I must mention Stauffenberg. Nobody was cooler and concentrated, more concentrated as him. And everybody came and asked him about every decision. He was fantastic on that day. War nicht angesteckt von der Atmosphäre, sondern beherrschte die Atmosphäre.
Ich hatte das Gefühl der Erleichterung. Es wurde nun endlich gehandelt. Auf den Tag hatten wir ja lange gewartet. Und als junger Mann ist man ja Optimist. Und ich glaubte, dass ein Erfolg durchaus möglich sei. Im Übrigen, als Soldat war man gewohnt, seinen Kopf zu riskieren. Auch das war also nichts Besonderes. Und deswegen sind wir mit meinen 3 Freunden zusammen, sind wir eigentlich sehr wohlgemut in die Bendlerstraße am Nachmittag des 20. Juli gegangen.
But then pretty soon I was listening to the telephone conversation which General Colonel Fromm, the commanding general of the Ersatzheer, had with Keitel. And the end was that he said to Herr Feldmarschall, I can rely, Hitler is alive. And Keitel must have said yes. Then I put the receiver back to the telephone. And that, of course, made a very bad impression to me, a really very bad impression. And I went back to, looked for Haften, and I said, now listen, we'll get in trouble because Fromm has talked with Keitel, and Keitel said that Hitler is alive. So then Stauffenberg came and all these stories which are well known, and we arrested Fromm.
Beim Vorbeifahren am innersten also am eigenen Führersperrkreis, also mit dem Führerbunker, Lagerbunker, da sahen wir also den Führer. Und da habe ich zum ersten Mal gesehen, dass der Führer nicht tot war, sondern dass der da quicklebendig, also mit seinem Hund spaziert, mit seiner Blondie. Und da ich ein Chef und Liebhaber bin, hat mir also diese Szene unwahrscheinlich also zugesagt, wie also der Hitler mit seiner Blondie da drin vorbei. Schön. In diesem Augenblick, als wir da standen, kam also Hitler auf uns zu. Und dann nahm er mich am Arm. Er hat mich also mit seinem linken Arm, hat er meinen rechten also genommen, ist mit mir in die Baracke reingegangen. Und da kam also wieder für mich etwas, was ich also sicher nie vergessen werde. Das erste Wort, das Hitler an mich richtete: Was sagen Sie dazu, dass mir nichts passiert ist? Ist das nicht ein Wunder?
Within hours of the explosion, despite his injuries, Hitler was able to meet Mussolini's special train as scheduled.
Inzwischen war es aber schon in der Bendlerstraße eine gewisse Unruhe. Nach und nach setzte auch die Dunkelheit ein. Und ich habe dann noch gehört, wie ein Schuss fiel und es hieß, nicht schießen. In dem Hof, die Tore zum Bendlerstraße wurden dann von einem Wachregiment besetzt. Keiner durfte raus und keiner durfte rein.
Shortly before midnight, General Fromm arrested the military leaders of the conspiracy inside the Bendlerstrasse. Stauffenberg assumed complete responsibility. General Beck was allowed to shoot himself. The others were led downstairs to the courtyard. General Albrecht was shot first. Stauffenberg was to be next, but Lieutenant von Haften threw himself in front of the Count and was shot instead. Only then was Stauffenberg killed. Colonel Merz von Quirnheim was the last to die. It was about midnight. The collapse of the 20th of July coup d'etat uncovered trails leading to the capture and arrest of other conspirators who, after August 1944, were put on a series of widely publicized show trials.
Was dachte denn nach dem, was Ihnen sagte, Ihr Neffe, dabei, was mit dem Führer geschehen soll? Es ist ja ein Umsturz nicht zu machen, ohne dass man irgendwie an die Person des Führers denkt. Nun,
das ist ohne Beseitigung des Führers nicht möglich.
Was verstehen Sie unter Beseitigung? Ein schillerndes, vielseitiges Wort. Mord. Dass also Umsturz mit Mord des Führers stattfinden soll.
Im Namen des deutschen Volkes.
Nikolaus Graf von Uexküll wurde von dem schon gerichteten Verräter Klaus Graf von Stauffenberg eingeweiht, dass ein Verschwörerkreis unseren Führer ermorden und uns dann unseren Feinden ausliefern wollte. verrieten, eidbrüchig, ehrlos, statt mannhaft wie das ganze deutsche Volk, dem Führer folgend, den Sieg zu erkämpfen, so wie noch niemand in unserer Geschichte das Opfer unserer Krieger, Volk, Führer und Reich. Verräter an allem, wofür wir leben und kämpfen, werden sie alle mit dem Tode bestraft. Ihr Vermögen verfällt dem Reich.
The resistors condemned to death were hanged with thin cords from meat hooks in the Plotzensee prison.
Treschow wusste, dass das Attentat bevorstand und dann hat er sehr bald davon gehört, dass es missglückt war. Als Treschow das gehört hat, hat er überhaupt zuerst nicht reagiert, keine Reaktion erkennen lassen. Und dann hat er mit Schlaberndorf gesprochen, der war bei ihm Ordnanzoffizier, und hat ihm gesagt, er würde Selbstmord verüben. Weil er wollte nicht in russische Hand fallen, in die Hand der Nazis fallen, weil er war nicht sicher, ob er den Erpressungsversuchen, den Folterungen widerstehen würde und ob er nicht irgendwelche Namen von Freunden preisgeben würde.
He died at the 21st of July, and we had a funeral in Wartenberg. But at this time, even my mother believed that he was fallen in battle. It was a suicide.
Ich hatte immer Mühe, meinen Mann wiederzufinden. Er kam von Potsdam mit Leber zusammen nach Brandenburg-Görden ins Zuchthaus, wo die Kommunisten hingebracht worden waren. Sie haben mich also in einen Raum geführt und dann kam er rein und Sträflingskleidung und Vollbart und furchtbar elend und blass und flüsterte nur. Und da kriegte ich eine Jacke von ihm zurück, die innen voller Blut war. Leber und Reichwein sind gefoltert worden und schwer geschlagen. Und schon in Potsdam, um auszusagen. Und man hat ihnen die Kehle zugedrückt, so lange, bis sie beinahe weg waren. Und dann mit Kaltwasser übergossen. Das hat mir alles also berichtet. Und da sind seine Stimmbänder kaputt gegangen und er hat nie wieder laut sprechen können, er hat nur flüstern können. Und deswegen hat er nachher auch im Volksgerichtshof gegenüber Preisler keinen Ton gesagt. Trotzdem haben die beiden keinen Namen ausgesagt. Und dann sind sie nach Plötzensee gebracht worden. Am nächsten Tag habe ich also da den Pförtner mit Zigarren bestochen und habe gesagt, ja, können Sie mir was aussagen über Leute, die gestern eingeliefert wurden? Ja, die leben alle nicht mehr.
Gerdler went into hiding. An award of 1 million marks was offered for his capture. He was subsequently betrayed to the police and tried in the People's Court.
Dass ein Versuch unternommen werden sollte, im Führerhauptquartier die Führung an sich zu reißen. Aha! Ich habe mir gewiss die Vorstellung gemacht, dass auf irgendeinem Wege versucht werden würde, die Person des Führers anzugreifen oder auszuschalten.
Also auf Deutsch, Sie haben sich gedacht, gewaltsam heißt, den Führer ermorden. Auszuschalten, anzugreifen oder auszuschalten, was heißt das denn sonst?
Gewiss.
Gewiss.
He had said to me, and I remember one of his last words were, "We've got to do it ourselves. It will happen. We've got to do it ourselves before the Allies have to do it for us." before the 20th of July, his health had suffered a great deal. He was gay enough, but though I think he knew exactly what he was heading for if it didn't succeed.
Ich habe mir sein Leben ja erst nachträglich klar gemacht. Im Krieg hatte man ja überhaupt keine Zeit. Wenn er abends nach Hause kam, dann aß er ihn, ja, ich möchte fast sagen, Sekundenschnelle. Meist war schon wieder irgendein Telefon da und dann fuhren wir entweder zu zweit irgendwo hin oder es kam jemand oder er musste alleine noch mal zu irgendeiner Besprechung. Ich habe nach dem Krieg, wenn ich von ihm träumte, mehrere Male geträumt, dass ich zu ihm wollte und Menschen uns trennten, die ihn eben brauchten und die er brauchte, eben um der Arbeit willen. Ne? Andererseits muss man natürlich auch sagen, ist so eine Riesenaufgabe, die man gestellt bekommt vom Schicksal, natürlich auch etwas sehr Gutes für eine Ehe. Denn sie holt die besten Kräfte aus beiden Partnern heraus und man kann die kleinen persönlichen Schwierigkeiten nicht mehr so ernst nehmen, wie man sie unter Umständen in einer Zeit ruhigen Wohlstands nehmen würde. Nie?
Sehen Sie denn nicht ein, dass wenn ein Volk schwer ringt und wenn dann einer von den wahrscheinlich Tausenden von Obersten, die es in der Armee dieses Volkes gibt, einer solchen Meinung ist, Verrat ist irgendwie abzuweichen von der Treue gegenüber dem Führer?
Diese Treuepflicht habe ich nicht mehr empfunden.
Aha. Ja. Das ist also klar. Sie haben sie nicht empfunden. Und dann, wenn ich keine Treue empfinde, dann kann ich doch nicht als Verrat ansehen.
Nein, so ist es nicht ganz. Sondern nach der Auffassung, die ich von der weltgeschichtlichen Rolle des Führers habe, nämlich, dass er ein großer Vollstrecker des Bösen ist, war es der Auffassung.
Ja, also das ist ja nur wahr. Dann ist ja also kein Wort zu sagen.
Jawohl.
Ich hatte mir im Gefängnis immer gedacht, ich kann den Kindern nicht sagen, dass er aufgehängt worden ist. Der zweite Sohn, Dirk, der hatte eben dann sofort gefragt, Mama, was heißt hingerichtet? Und da hatte ich dann gesagt, sie sind aufgehängt worden. Hat er mich gefragt, Mama, wie konnte Gott es zulassen, einen so guten Menschen wie Papa auf diese Weise sterben zu lassen? Da habe ich ihm gesagt, Dirk, verstehen können wir es nicht. Wir können nur vertrauen.
We went up to Berlin, Charlotte and I, because she said I must be near him, maybe I can see him. I went to the Gestapo Hauptquartier and asked if I could deliver a letter or anything, and they just said, will you please go? Just go. We don't want to see you here. Go. Later on, I realized that he had been there until 8 o'clock in the morning in this Gestapo quartier and had then been led to the Volksgerichtshof and then to his death. Charlotte got a bill about 2 months later. I've forgotten if it was 150 marks for the execution. That was all.
Wir haben diese Tat auf uns genommen, um Deutschland vor einem namenlosen Elend zu bewahren. Ich bin mir klar, dass ich daraufhin gehängt werde, bereue meine Tat aber nicht und hoffe, dass sie ein anderer in einem glücklicheren Augenblick, um uns vor dem Chaos zu bewahren, durchführen wird.
I have seen a great deal of him in the prison, and he was very impressive, cool, friendly, he behaved excellent as a prisoner.
I saw him once more after the trial, on the 18th of January. And I went back to Kreisau for the weekend, where I always fetched food, and then I came back again and was again in Berlin, and just had written a letter saying that I had returned. He got that letter in the morning. That was the day he was killed, 23rd of January. And I, of course, did not expect him to. I didn't know what would happen in the circumstances, that the Allies had just come, but the Allies were so slow in coming, so we hoped they would come in time, of course, that kind of thing. No, that goes without saying.
And he was prepared to pay. He was a human being who tried to escape as late as possible execution or death. He wanted to live.
But when it was unavoidable, he knew. That was the great thing in his letters and poems. And he knows from the beginning up to the end, the more spiritual you are, the more politically you must be again. And he once put that in that little sentence together: only if you cry for the Jews, you are permitted to sing Gregorian chants.
The Abwehr resistance group had been moved from one prison or concentration camp to another since 1943. Hans von Donani was eventually executed in Sachsenhausen. On April 9, 1945, 1 month before VE Day, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, Colonel Hans Oster, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer were hanged in Flossenburg concentration camp. I am of the rock-firm conviction, now as before, that we have acted rightly. I consider Hitler not only as the archenemy of Germany, but as the archenemy of the world. Not one of us can complain about his own death. Whoever entered our circle thereby put on the shirt of Nessus. The moral worth of a human being begins only then, when he is ready to lay down his own life for his convictions.